Let me go to the other issue, which I really like to talk about. Mourdock's a tax cheat. When I was elected in 2006, I bought a condominium up in Indianapolis because I wasn't going to leave beautiful Darmstadt. So I bought a condo. The prior owner of the condo had a homestead property tax credit and a mortgage exemption. As you probably know, when a real estate transaction takes place, the auditor is supposed to take away all the pre-existing ones, and you then apply for a homestead property tax credit, or you apply for a mortgage exemption. I did not apply for a homestead property tax credit, and I didn't even have a mortgage, so that would have been real hard to have gotten a mortgage exemption because you have to show proof of a mortgage. We do the deal, we go down the road. A year and a half, 2 years later, I get, as I'm betting all of you who own homes get, or got, you received a check from the county when the homestead property tax refunds occurred. Remember that a couple years ago? I got my check. And I said, this doesn't belong to me. I walked over to the city-county building, which is just 2 blocks from my condo, and I said, this doesn't belong to me. I don't have a homestead property tax credit. And they said, well, it needs to go to the people who had it before. And I said, I don't know where they are. And they said, well, actually, it goes to the property anyway, because the things are in arrears. So at that point, I said, you know, how did I get this? And they said, well, it still shows you have a homestead. And I said, I never applied for it. Well, fill out a form. I filled out a form to take off the homestead property tax credit that had continued on. A couple of weeks later, I did little bit of research trying to find out where the people owned it before. They weren't around. I couldn't find them. I cashed the check. Okay. Another couple of years, year and a half goes by. And each time now I get my tax bill, the first page of the tax bill says, you are entitled to, it's a separate page, it's a pink form in Marion County, maybe here, it says you are entitled to a homestead property tax credit. Okay, great, I don't need one. I throw the form away. I look at the bill, like everybody else, get mad as hell and paid the bill. And we did that a couple times. And then this past May, just 11 months ago, I'm getting ready to pay my bill, and all of a sudden, wait a minute, the homestead property is still there. So again, I marched over to the auditor's office. I said, this isn't right. I have filled out a form. I've told you I don't get this. And they finally, in my presence, because I demanded they do it in my presence, they got on the system and they took the homestead property tax credit and the mortgage exemption off. They added a note to the file that said the taxpayer has never made an error, that this was an error of the auditor's office, that the taxpayer brought it to their attention. I then said, okay, what do I owe in back taxes? Because you self-reported, you don't owe anything. Not good enough. Take it back. Well, we can only go back 2 years by law. Not good enough. Is there? Yes, 3 years. So I ended up paying 3 years of back taxes. And it took them until September of last year to figure out what I owed them. And when they sent me the bill, within 24, 48 hours, I paid the bill. So again, the record's in the file. It wasn't my error. I tried previously to correct it. And they added a letter that says every tax bill I've ever been sent, I've paid on time and gone beyond the limits. The other issue that they have in the TV commercial, and as you can tell, I get rather livid on this stuff, forgive me, but the other issue is Mourdock buys junk bonds. Well, all I'll say to that is, it is amazing that Mr. Lugar, who wants to attack me on this issue, seems to think the investment I made wasn't worthy enough credit that I should have made it on behalf of the people I represent as a fiduciary. But he thinks it's okay for you to own the company. Because that's what happened with Chrysler. It took it off the people, took the money away from the people I represent, so you could own this good investment. So it wasn't good enough for me to do on behalf of my investors, but it was good enough to dump on all of you. And that is just a ludicrous position. With the so-called junk bonds, I would like to do this too. If I have some bonds to sell you today, so let's say I've got some junk bonds, I got some speculative bonds, I got some high yield bonds. Which ones do you want to buy?
High yield bonds.
They're all exactly the same thing. It's the same piece of paper. One person calls it a junk bond, somebody else calls it a high yield bond. It's exactly the same piece of paper. And when we bought that debt, this Chrysler, of course, we were secured creditors. You know, I still get asked if I had to fight that fight again, would I do it? Absolutely. That was unprecedented in what the federal government did, ripping away the rights of secured creditors. And in the case of Indiana, our retired teachers in our retired state police officers. I had a fiduciary duty to represent them, and I did.
You just took my next question.
Okay.
You would fight that again.
Yeah, I would. You know, it was fascinating. It was the most trying time of my political existence, and I was oddly enough convinced when that was happening, my political career is over. This is so unpopular, but I don't care because it was the right thing to do. You know, my job description, which is my oath of office, I keep on the wall. It says I will support the laws of the state of Indiana and support and uphold the Constitution of the United States. That's what Chrysler was about, in violation of the Fifth Amendment, the 10th Amendment, Article 1, Section 8. I mean, it's just, and ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court granted our writ of certiorari and pursuant to our plea, struck down the decision of the underlying court in the case. Now, unfortunately, the bucket was empty by then. We couldn't get our money back. But it made the very point that we had said all along, if you let the Chrysler precedent stand, other companies all across America are going to show up and say, just give me the Chrysler deal. Let me pick and choose among my creditors who I want to keep, who I don't. And instead of having this orderly, secured, non-secured, let me just make it up on the fly. And I said at the time, if that is the law, there's absolute chaos in the world of commercial finance. And that's what started to happen. And that's why the Supreme Court walked it back and vacated their decision, or vacated the decision of the Second Circuit.
A lot of times you don't see an incumbent senator being challenged in a primary say much at all about his opponent. What do you think is the dynamics of the race?
You mean on an issue-by-issue basis, or?
Well, in general, a lot of these things have been, you know, they're talking about you. And I remember early in the campaign, I got an email, I get them all, saying that they had a poll that he was ahead 55 to 30.
And that was the poll that they took the week after they fired their pollster of 15 years.
Okay. So, you know, just as a student in politics, if you were ahead 25 points, you probably wouldn't talk a lot about your opponent. What do you think is going on?
You hit it exactly. If you were ahead 25 points, in fact, I'm convinced, I can't prove this, but you mentioned the debate, someone mentioned the debate. I'm convinced they had two sets of commercials in the can. The day after the debate, they were going to run one set or the other. I think if Mr. Lugar had crushed me during the debate, if I'd made some phenomenal error, so it was clear that Senator Lugar had won, I think the ads you'd be seeing today is the great statesman Richard Lugar, he's done this, and done this. My worst reporting, which is to say the worst perspective of any reporting from the debate, Mourdock tied. If you're a challenger, a tie's a win. And so they went with Plan B, which are these incredibly heinous negative ads. And I'll tell you from our polling, and you've seen it, I suspect, we released it yesterday, it isn't sticking. You know, in the internals of our polling, people were asked, what do you most dislike about Dick Lugar? What do you most dislike about Richard Mourdock? 68% came right back to say they had something they disliked about Dick Lugar. 70% couldn't think of anything bad about Richard Mourdock. And amazingly, 2% said it was because he doesn't show up for work. They've spent $2 million running negative ads, and 2% of the, and again, we're talking about Republican primary voters. 2% think I don't show up for work. It is the most amazing set of polling I've ever seen.
But on the same case, you said that 70% couldn't come up with something negative. You were a county official, and now you're the state treasurer, which isn't a high-profile office. So, what does that say about name recognition? Do you have a concern that you don't have the high-profile?
That's a fair question, but among Republican voters, and this, I don't know what my name ID was of the poll we did this week, which is the one I'm referring to, but in the poll we did about 6 weeks ago among Republican primary voters, I had 87% name ID. I'd actually gone up from 54 to 87% in a year without running a single TV ad, which was because of the great grassroots team we have. So your point is valid, and again, 6 weeks ago, 54% of Republicans didn't know enough about me one way or another to have an opinion, and yet now you still look at the numbers and all the negative stuff he's run hasn't stuck. It is, and that's why, as I told my campaign staff yesterday when we were announcing the numbers, people were jumping up and down, you know, we're leading for the first time. And I said, have a happy moment, that's okay, but get ready because it's going to get a lot worse. Anything they can find, they're going to throw at us. And that's part of the process. I don't like it, but it is part of the process. And that's why I'm comfortable talking about property taxes and attendance and junk bonds and all this stuff, because I know from what we're seeing and what I feel in traveling the state as much as I do, we're in a great position to make some history underneath.
What does the poll straight up show right here?
Straight up, it shows I'm leading 38 to 37 among those definites. Did you all not get it? I'd be glad to get it for you.
I haven't read it.
Okay. And it was 42, just 42, 41, 40, something like that. I'm ahead when you include the leaners. And I'll tell you something. If you're a United States Senator and you've been there 36 years and you need leaners to even get to 40%, it's not good. It's not good.
And this poll's commissioned by?
It was a poll we did, but it was done by John McLaughlin, who is a very well-respected pollster in D.C.
What are you going to say tonight at the Right to Life dinner?
Well, I don't, my part there tonight is simply to introduce Michael Reagan.
Not speaking.
Right, I'm not speaking.
What do you think, any exceptions you'd make for abortion?
Sure, fair question. The only exception I have is life of the mother. And
Rape or incest?
no, I don't have that as an exception. You know, years ago I used to, and the more I look at the issue, the more I study the issue, I found myself thinking, should we be making that decision? And I came back to what I said, just life of the mother. And I know people disagree with that, but
Someone might counter that a rapist shouldn't be able to pick the mother of his child.
understand, but someone could counter too, life is life.
Okay.
Appreciate the question.
On that thread, if a woman stipulating that since Roe v. Wade still the law of the land and a woman can't have an abortion, what procedure, pre-abortion procedures do you think a woman should be subject to? What's reasonable, and where do we cross the line? You know, some of this legislation in Virginia and some of these other places have gotten a lot of national attention. In your mind, if a woman is going to have an abortion, what kind of pre-abortion procedures should she be subject to?
Well, first, as a federal candidate, let me say I do believe the states have the right to make those distinctions, and you refer to the Virginia plan, and Indiana certainly had similar things. You know, I am not, obviously haven't been in the legislature to cast a vote, but as I understand Indiana's law of a few years ago, they put a stipulation in when there would be an ultrasound. I think that's right, I could be wrong. But I see that as being something important and worthwhile, and you know, that so-called waiting period from the first time to, you know, reasonable waiting period of 24 hours, 48 hours, I think something like that is reasonable.
Another hot button issue right now is immigration. Can you talk a little bit about your feelings on immigration, the DREAM Act, and some of those issues?
Sure thing. And I'm enjoying this. I hope you guys know that. On the immigration issue, and I will tell you from polling we've done, again, this amazes me. It just blows me away. Among Republican primaries and primary voters in Indiana, and 3 polls we've taken over 15 months, it is always the #1 issue, which I never would have expected. But to immigration, obviously, we have to do more on the border to make sure we have less people coming in illegally. I think it is unrealistic to think we're ever going to be rounding up people and shipping them out of the country in some massive fashion. The best plan, and I say this not just because he's a friend of mine, but I think the best plan that's been put out, unfortunately didn't go very far, was a plan that Mike Pence and I think it was Kay Bailey Hutchinson might have put together a few years ago, that basically said if people who were here as illegals would go back to their country of origin, they could go to either their U.S. consulate or the U.S. embassy in those countries, and there would be what they deemed in their legislation to be Ellis Island centers, which is to say they could go in if they could demonstrate that they were in this country, they've been here for a certain period of time, they had evidence that they've been working here, that would allow local officials in that community to check, make sure there weren't outstanding warrants and those kind of things. I think if people did that voluntarily, that they ought to absolutely be expedited with a visiting worker type permit to be able to come back in. I think that would be a sound approach and a good way to start. I certainly don't believe amnesty is the answer. I think that's been more of a problem in the past during the Reagan years. It certainly, I think, led to some of the problems we have today. On the DREAM Act specifically, and let's make sure we're all in the same field here, the DREAM Act deals with the children of illegal immigrants. And that's not to say the children of illegals born in this country, because they are U.S. citizens. So we can argue whether that's a good thing or not, but that's not who we're talking about. The DREAM Act would help provide some special rights to those children who were ostensibly carried across the border in their mother's arms, and look, they didn't do anything wrong, why should they be punished? In the 1970s, that might have been seen as a compassionate bit of legislation because, you know, a few hundred kids and what are we going to do? Okay. But we don't have a few hundred kids anymore. We're talking from 12 to 15 million illegals in this country. I think it's a bad piece of legislation because of this fundamental question. If you reward bad behavior, are you going to get more or less of it in the future? You're going to get more. So if in some way we take the children of those illegals and say, yeah, well, you didn't do anything wrong, but your parents did, all we're going to do is give the green light to more parents to come across the border so their kids can get in line, or hopefully get in line for some future program. And it shouldn't be government's role, now I'll go back to Chrysler, it shouldn't be government's role to pick winners and losers. It shouldn't be picking winners and losers in the car industries. It shouldn't be picking winners and losers in healthcare as to who gets a healthcare waiver and who doesn't. And it shouldn't be picking winners and losers in that broad sense of an immigration policy based especially upon some illegal act that initiated the whole discussion.
Who guards the border?
Pardon?
Who would you have guard the border?
Well, I think the present folks down there, the Immigration Service, do a pretty good job.
To expand it?
I would expand it. You know, I heard someone say it, and I don't recall who it was in one of the presidential debates, but for those of us who travel much at all and we see what's happening in the airports, the Transportation Safety Agency, for all the funding that's going that direction, which is seemingly not being spent that effectively, I could even see money from there going in that direction. I mean, it is something that we would have to budget carefully to make sure it happens, but I think it has to be done. You know, the biggest thing right now, well, immigration's down. Why is that? It's because of the state of the economy. When we start to get the economy back going again, that's when we're going to have to worry. And by the way, how can we be 40 minutes into this discussion and not having spoken of the economy? Something hits me.
World question, what's the solution with Iran?
Great question. We have to isolate Iran in every way we can. I think the Obama administration has been leading from behind since day one, and I think it's a very, very bad thing for America and the world. This came up during the debate the other day, and I made the point that Mr. Lugar had refused to sign on and move through the Foreign Relations Committee a bill that Senator John Kyle and Joe Lieberman had brought forward to provide for unilateral sanctions against Iran, North Korea, and Syria. And Mr. Lugar blocked it, thinking we ought to do that through the United Nations. Well, as long as Russia and China are on the Security Council, we're not going to get anything like that in blocking Syria, in blocking Iran. You know, what's happening in Syria today has important implications to what happens in Iran. Again, as I mentioned the other night, we're spending over $1 billion a year into Russia so they can take down their nukes. Russia sends money to Syria, and Syria is sending money to Iran. So on the one hand, while we're trying to take down nukes at this end of the scale, money being fungible, and all money is, we're actually sending money there. We need to be isolating Syria as well. Now, Syria is the only Arab ally that Iran has, and they prop each other up. Syria is also an oil producer, although obviously not to the extent Iran is. But we have to be isolating those countries more and more, and something we cannot be doing continually, which this administration has done, and I believe Mr. Lugar has actively been a part of, is causing more instability in the Middle East by showing indifference at best to Israel. When the Saudi plan was originally announced about 8 years ago, Dick Lugar was the first person in the U.S. government that we can find that came out supporting it. It is the Saudi plan that would cause Israel to withdraw to its 1967 borders. That is craziness. When Obama made his comment last May that Israel should withdraw to its 1967 borders, Mr. Lugar was interviewed, and I remember his quote. He said, no, he won't be taking the president to task for his views. Well, believe me, he should be taking him to task. And I understand he's not because he agrees with him. But if we want to promote instability in the Middle East, there is no better way to do it than to show indifference to Iran, or to Israel rather. And that's what's happening. It's an amazing place. And unless we see Israel strong and prospering, you're not going to see stability in the rest of the Middle East. You know, when the country was formed, we were the natural ally. And you may remember the history. It was 12 minutes after Israel declared its independence that Harry Truman signed off and recognized them as the first country to recognize another country. And we did it then because of our shared Judeo-Christian values, and that's fine. But today, we need them there simply from the point of view of economic trade, especially the high-tech computer stuff and the pharmaceutical stuff. I mean, they're a vital trading partner, and they're providing stability. And as long as we continue to vacillate back there and lead from the rear, Syria again, the modern day or the present day example, it's not good. You know,
So will lead from the front be military action?
first of all, it means further steps to isolate. Had we been leading from the front, by the way, when the so-called Green Revolt took place, 2 years ago, I think it was in '09, and we were seeing this uprising in Iran that had the United States sent any signal of support whatsoever, they might well have toppled the government of the Ayatollahs and got rid of Ahmadinejad. But instead, we sat back and said nothing. So, yeah, I think you have to isolate them, number one, economically as much as you can. You have to bolster what Israel's talking about doing, and I don't mean that in overt terms, but in defending itself. You just can't be indifferent. We have to be sending the message that we're going to isolate that country.
So how do you prepare Americans for the fact that if you involve the military and you tend to isolate, or you embargo the oil, that it may be $6 or $7 gas?
Great question. As I said a moment ago, you know, you've got to be out there bringing people along, understanding the argument ahead of time, not after the argument. You know, when the first Gulf War broke out, everyone said the gas was going to go up to $9. Oil was going to go to $200. What happened? The price of oil fell dramatically. Same thing happened with the second Gulf War. The regime in Iran, for all its bullying, for all its blustering, if it ever comes to something military, they're not going to be there in place very long. And I don't think you're going to see that kind of spike in prices. Might there be a very short one? Yeah, I think so. But it's not going to be that long-term spike.
I think you probably agree the oil market's a little different today, though, than it was even 20 years ago.
I will agree it's different, but largely it's not because of supply and demand. It's because price of oil, the currency, the speculation is about speculation of currency value more than it is oil value.
What do you see America's role with China being over the next 20 years or so?
Another great question. I will give the Obama administration at least a B+, maybe even an A- on this one. You know, they have recognized that we, and certainly not the Bush administration, George W., wasn't as actively engaged in the Pacific Rim as what Obama is. We have to be dealing with China in a fair trade type of arrangement. We have to recognize they are that growing power. But we have to recognize as well that they now have somewhere between 40 and 60 submarines. While we sit here in Evansville, Indiana on April 19th, their first aircraft carrier is undergoing sea trials. They've already demonstrated their 5th generation stealth fighter aircraft. They aren't doing these things simply because they like to play with boats and airplanes. They are doing it to exert their force around the world. We have to be meeting that head on as well. As they put more and more pressure on their trading partners, we have to be ready to be there. You know, I want to see the open markets, I want to see the trade, and we have to understand for more and more we're going to be in a competitive situation with them in bringing back world resources, meaning natural resources. You know, they've done a pretty good job thus far, especially in the Pacific Rim and Australia in particular, in developing both heavy metals, iron ore, and also coal. You know, that Australia is booming right now largely because of Chinese investment. And by the way, again, we haven't spoken much of the economy, but I gotta go that way. May I, from your question, because it's...
Could I throw you
Sure,
one on
sure.
that thread, since we're talking
Sure.
about China? What can you get China to do to fairly evaluate its currency? And what do you think the relationship is between the cost of Chinese exports and the American manufacturing base?
Okay, to the first question, they are now doing what they weren't doing for a number of years. Are they doing it aggressively enough in letting the yuan actually reach a fair value price against the US dollar? They're getting better, so I see improvement there. That certainly there is more fluctuation in their currency. They were holding their currency stable for a long time artificially, but now it's starting to fluctuate, and it's probably coming back to more fair value. And what was your second question?
Well, the relationship between the valuation of the currency and how it affects the U.S. manufacturing base.
Sure, it's absolutely had an impact, but it hasn't impacted the U.S. manufacturing base nearly as much as the United States government has.
Okay.
You know, I believe, whether it's American farmers or American manufacturing, American technology, we have the most productive workforce anywhere. Time and time again, when you look at it on an item-by-item basis, it's true. But not enough people are asking the question, why is it there is a flight of capital from the United States? Why is it, and I can name you 10 businessmen here in Evansville, Indiana, who own businesses in China or Korea or India or Mexico? Why is it those people from Evansville, Indiana and all over Indiana are packing up and putting plants other places?
It's not because labor's a lot cheaper?
No, it's not.
What is
And
it?
ask them, please, another good research project.
Whirlpool, for example, didn't
That's
move
part-
operations because labor was cheaper elsewhere?
Not entirely,
Okay.
not entirely. You go talk to the people up in, where they are in Michigan.
Benton
Benton Harbor, thank you. And what you're gonna hear, because I've heard this in the people I've spoken to, they're more concerned about the future of the rules. You know, I talked to a guy not long ago that had a chance to build a new plant. In this country, he decided not to do it. The big 3 auto companies wanted him to do it, and he wasn't gonna do it. He was getting close to retirement, and he found out it was gonna take 5 years to get this thing built and permitted and all that. Someone from South Korea found out about it. They came back, talked to him, no, I don't wanna invest in Korea. Long story, he gave them the plans, came back, said, we can have this in 18 months. Said, you can have my permit in 18 months? No, we can have the plant built in 18 months. Exact same plan. Exact same environmental standards. Business people in the United States are more concerned about the future, not knowing what the rules are gonna be. They don't know what taxes are. They don't know what the environmental regulations are gonna be. They don't know what healthcare is gonna cost them. They don't know what OSHA is gonna do to them. That's what the uncertainty is about. Again, this would make a wonderful series for you. Talk to Indiana businesses who have invested overseas and why they do it. And you're gonna hear this theme over and over again. It's not about productivity. Yeah, on a per hour basis, people in Mexico work for much less than they do here. I'm not saying there isn't a labor differential, but a lot of times that labor differential can be made up in productivity.